If you have your Bibles open to the second chapter of the book of Revelation, our text will be verses 8 through 11, Revelation 2, 8 through 11. We are considering the seven churches of Asia. In the second chapter of Revelation, the third chapter of Revelation, we see a specific letter that Jesus himself is dictating to the Apostle John for delivery to the pastors of each of these churches so that Jesus' letter could be read to each congregation. How powerful would that be? It's equally powerful today because we not only have one letter, we have seven. Last week we looked at the letter to the church of Ephesus, and we found that it was a bit of a mixed bag. There were things they were doing well, and Jesus complimented them for that. But there was one thing in particular they were doing wrong, and Jesus called them on it. They had left their first love. They were doing a lot of good things, but oftentimes doing them for the wrong reason. Everything the church is about should be about Jesus. Today, we move on to the church in Smyrna. Smyrna was a city about 35 miles north of Ephesus. Smyrna would have been evangelized during the 3 years that Paul was in Ephesus, and the gospel spread not only in Ephesus, but to the surrounding communities, and that is most likely where this church came from. The letter to the church in Smyrna is unique because there's no criticism. It is simply a blessing of the church that is doing well in very poor circumstances. Our purpose in studying these letters is not just a history lesson, but to learn how we can apply the message that Jesus gave to these seven churches 2,000 years ago to our church today, right here in Florida Highlands. And as we go through this message, we will see there is much about the church in Smyrna that we can and should apply to ourselves as the church today in Florida Highlands. The word Smyrna comes from the same root word from which we get the word myrrh, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh is an aromatic, a gum, a paste that comes from crushing particular plants and pounding them into something that is fragrant and extraordinarily pleasant. Well, that's an apt analogy for the church in Smyrna because Smyrna was truly a crushed church. You will see that this message is going to divide itself almost into two parts. And I will tell you right now, the first part is very dark. The first part is very discouraging. The first part might make someone say, well, I don't want to have any of that in my life. And yet, as we move forward to the conclusion of the text, we will see the blessings that are built in to the suffering of the church of Smyrna. Let's read together Revelations 2, verses 8 through 11. Write to the angel of the church in Smyrna, the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life, says, I know your affliction and poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will have affliction for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Anyone who has an ear should listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. The victor will never be harmed by the second death. There are 5 words in this text that are the key to understanding the bad situation in which the church in Smyrna found itself. The first word is affliction. Some of you may have a translation that says tribulation. It means exactly the same thing. These are not small problems. These are not inconveniences. Tribulation is just almost more than the church can bear. I mentioned last week that during this time period, the very end of the first century, the empire, Caesar, in the person of Domitian, had declared himself to be a god. And if you're a god, you demand worship. And Domitian, as well as other emperors who followed, demanded that people in the Roman Empire worship them as God. And they constructed temples to themselves. One temple to the emperor's cult was in Smyrna. And the Christians in Smyrna were expected to worship Caesar as Lord. They said, well, we can't do that. Caesar's not Lord. The Lord is the Lord. Well, you can still worship Jesus, but you have to worship Caesar at the same time. All you have to do is go to the temple and burn some incense, and that'll be enough. And the Christians in Smyrna, the church in Smyrna said, no, we cannot do that. We are commanded that we are to worship God and only God. And so the church in Smyrna, in sort of a perverse situation, found itself to be outlawed. People who were living outside of the law. The law said you had to worship the emperor. And because they would not worship the emperor, they were violating the law. And because they were violating the law, they had to be punished. And they could not be trusted to conduct affairs in the Roman Empire, because if you won't do the most basic thing you're required to do, worship Caesar, then we're not going to let you do anything else either. They lost their jobs. They lost their homes. They lost any means of supporting themselves. They were in poverty. I understand that Florida Highlands is not the most economically prosperous area of Marion County. But we don't know anything about poverty compared to the saints who were the church in Smyrna. They literally were destitute. They were living just on the street. They were living in caves. They were eating whatever cast-offs they could find. People who would try to help them were then themselves considered outlaws. They were aiding and abetting these outlaws who would not worship Caesar, and they too would be punished. So part of this tribulation was just the abject poverty, the just almost on the knife's edge of not being able to survive. But it gets worse. A group of people who are described as being Jews, but not really Jews, are slandering the church in Smyrna. Now, a lot of people have written a lot of things about what this really means. Were these truly Jewish people who were outside the will of God, no longer claimed the promise of Abraham, so were no longer appropriate to be called Jews? Or were they people who weren't even really Jews at all, but were pretending to be so? It almost doesn't matter, because...
I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you something about this, the poverty in line in King James, but it says thou art rich. Is he speaking?
We're coming to that.
Okay, I say he's
It says poverty first.
Mine says, yeah, poverty, that says, but they're rich. I was wondering if he's talking money or spiritual.
No, hang in there and you're going to find out. Because we're talking about the poverty right now. And so what was happening is these people, whether they were truly ethnic Jews who were outside of Judaism, or whether they were imposters, people just pretending to be Jews, these people were slandering the Christians. Slander means saying something that is not true. The Christians were in enough trouble for things they were doing, things that were the truth. It's a fact. They would not worship Caesar. And yet these Jews are piling on insult to injury and getting these Christians into more and more trouble, so that in their poverty, in this slander, just as Frank mentioned, the word says, yet you are rich. Well, that almost sounds like nonsense. How can this possibly be true? They were poor in matters of this world, but they were rich in spirit, and we will see how that promise comes to fruition in really the conclusion of this text. So they were afflicted, they were impoverished, they were being slandered, they were going to prison. The devil, and it's interesting to see, the devil is the one who is going to cast themselves into prison. Now, prison today is not a pleasant place, and it's not a pleasant experience. Some of you, I know, have had experiences with incarceration. Some of us have good friends who have been incarcerated. Some of us, I've been in and out of prisons multiple times in my career as a lawyer. And every time I would hear those doors slam, I would kind of think, I hope I don't lose my visitor's card. But a prison today is the Ritz-Carlton compared to what a prison would have been 2,000 years ago. It truly was a black hole in the dungeon. And the devil was further causing persecution of the church in Smyrna so that people would be in prison. Now, it's interesting to see that it says you will have this affliction for 10 days. Does that mean literally 10 days? Or, remember, we're in the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature, and oftentimes words and phrases are used to make a point rather than be literally true, but it was some defined period of time, and we'll talk about that in a minute as we finish this sermon. But they were going to be thrown into prison. So let me get this straight. You got tribulation. You're being persecuted for no reason other than you worship Christ and not the emperor. You're impoverished to the point of destitution. People are using their own supposed religiosity, Jews, to slander you. You're going to be thrown into prison, and beyond that, you are going to face death. People were dying for their faith in the church in Smyrna. Some of you will have heard of a person named Polycarp. Polycarp was an early church father who, as a young man, had been a protege of the Apostle John, the same apostle to whom these letters were dictated by Jesus. At that time, this was before John was sent to prison in Patmos, he was living in Ephesus. And Polycarp was his student. Polycarp was his understudy. Polycarp was learning under the Apostle John. Polycarp was one step away from the apostles. Polycarp lived to be 86 years old. And Polycarp, at that time, lived in Smyrna, just north of Ephesus. And Polycarp fell into this persecution, which has been going on for, in round figures, about 50 years since these words were written. And Polycarp was brought before the tribunal, accused of being opposed to Caesar. He was accused of being an atheist. He was, and we talked about this last week, it's kind of perverse, but if the law says you have to worship Caesar and you won't worship Caesar, Roman government said you're an atheist. He wasn't an atheist, he was a Christian, but he certainly wasn't worshiping Caesar. And they told him, says, this is pretty simple. All you have to do is acknowledge Caesar as Lord and you can go your own way. And Polycarp says, well, I cannot do that. I have served him faithfully for 86 years. He has never been untrue to me. I cannot abandon my king. And the Roman authorities said, well, if you don't, you're gonna be put to death. You're gonna be executed. And Polycarp says, effectively, if I am, I am. But I'm not going to deny Christ. And Polycarp was burned to death at the stake. He is perhaps the most famous martyr from Smyrna, but he's not the only martyr from Smyrna. The church in Smyrna was under great affliction. So how does this sound to you so far? You're being afflicted, you're in poverty material-wise, you're being slandered, you're thrown into prison, and you're given death sentences. I told you the first part of this message was a little dark, a little bleak. Well, this is just old ancient history, right? Nothing like that could happen in the world today, could it? Well, I'm not at all so sure about that. Jesus, in the 16th chapter of John, verse 33, makes two promises. And both of his promises will be true. The first, he says, in this world, you will have trouble. Doesn't say you might have trouble. Doesn't say somebody's going to have trouble. We will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus was an overcomer. He starts the book of Revelation. He mentions in his introduction to the letter of Smyrna, and he says over and over again, words, sometimes a little different words, but basically saying the same thing. I was dead, and now I'm alive. Jesus overcame death. If Jesus overcomes death, we can overcome whatever the world throws at us. We live in a society that is increasingly hostile to Christianity. I look around this group, and there's some young folks here, but most of us are of a certain age, and most of your memories are going to be similar to mine. And there was a time when it was very convenient to be a Christian. There was a time when most people, nominally at least, declared themselves to be Christians. I've said before, I can close my eyes right now and remember my first grade class. And I can tell you pretty much everybody that's in that class. I can tell you who their brothers and sisters were. I can tell you who their dog was. And yeah, everybody had a dog back then. And I can tell you what church they went to. Folks went to church. It was easy, it was convenient, it was popular. It's not quite so easy today. It's not quite so popular today. But thank God that we still live in a country where we have freedom to live and freedom to worship. Nobody requires us to worship Caesar. Nobody requires us to worship the government. And I pray that that will continue to be God's blessing for us. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. You look around the world today and you see, even in our own society, more and more people demanding that we acknowledge things as true that are false and acknowledge things as false that are true. Just to the north, our neighbor in Canada has a law against hate speech. And that maybe kind of sounds pretty good. We don't want to speak hatefully. I don't want to speak hatefully of people. But they define hate speech to mean anything that hurts anybody's feelings. If you read the first chapter of Romans in Canada, you can be subject to arrest because that might hurt somebody's feelings who's a homosexual. If you announce and if you proclaim that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, and nobody comes to the Father but by him, you can be arrested, because that's hateful to Muslims or Jews or Hindus or people that don't have any God whatsoever. Is that going to happen in our country? I don't know if it will. I don't know if it won't. If it won't. But here's what I know for a fact. We must obey God rather than men. In your sermon notes, you see that in Acts the 5th chapter, verse 29, where Peter and John were hauled once again before the Sanhedrin. And they were told, you just got to quit talking about Jesus. You can't keep telling people that Jesus is God. You can't keep telling people that Jesus was raised from the dead, because that's undermining our gig right here. That's undermining a pretty good situation that we have. And if Jesus really is God, then we killed him, and we're going to be in trouble, and people are going to quit believing us, and people are going to quit supporting us in the grand style to which we've been accustomed. And Peter and John say, yeah. I mean, that's not literally in the words, but I kind of say, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but we must obey God rather than men. We do not live, sometimes we think that we live in a little bit of persecution. Sometimes we think we live in a society where people maybe look down on us a little bit because we're Christians. Well, we're not impoverished because of our faith. We're not slandered because of our faith. We're not put in prison because of our faith. We're not killed because of our faith. I don't know if we'll have to face those obstacles or not. But I'll tell you, we don't face some of the obstacles we have very well. People attend church kind of when it's convenient. Depends on whether it's, is it rainy? Is it sunshiny? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Do I have something better to do? Do I need to play golf? Do I need to go hunting? Do I need to go bowling? Do I need to go take a nature trip? Do I need to do any of these different things? Well, if I ain't got anything else better to do, I'll go to church. Well, we get stymied just by the tiniest temptations of Satan. It's like one of my children was talking about one of her children that was easily distracted and made the comment, said, well, she'd be walking along and, oh, there's a shiny thing. And before she knows it, she's off the sidewalk and she's chasing that. She forgot where she's supposed to be going. We're that way with church sometimes. Yeah, we say we like it. We say it means something to us. And yet, it seems like anything else comes up first. Well, if we really have affliction, if we really have the type of testing that Smyrna had, then we're going to find out what our faith is really about. The end of this text is a bright spot in a serious, serious way. Jesus gives us the assurance that he will be with us even in the midst of tribulation. And Frank, that's going back to what those verses really mean. I don't care how bad it is physically. What's about the worst thing can happen to you? Somebody kill you. And some people, oh, there's a fate worse than death. And I understand what we're saying. But basically, about the worst thing that somebody do to you is kill you. And Jesus effectively is saying, death, that's no big deal. I've been dead, and now I am alive. Jesus tells us not to be afraid. Jesus told the church in Smyrna, I know what you're going through. I see it. Don't be afraid. I was dead. I am alive. And if they kill you, you will live forever in heaven. And that is a message we need to know. We need to understand that God is in control. I don't care how hot it gets in your life. God's hands on the thermostat. God is controlling what happens. That takes us back to this concept of 10 days. Does 10 days literally mean 10 days? Does it mean 10 periods of persecution? Is it a metaphor for a relatively short period of time? It doesn't matter. The point is this. God has set the time for the persecution. God has said this far and no farther. And whatever else is going on in your life, know and understand that God is in control. If Satan is tempting you, if Satan is throwing obstacles in your path, if the adversary is doing everything he can to keep us from doing what we know we're supposed to be doing as faithful worshipers of the Lord Jesus Christ, understand that that same Satan's on a leash. Sometimes the leash is a little longer, sometimes the leash is a little shorter. We've seen dogs that people, put on a rope or something, they tie to a tree, and you go walking by and the dog's barking, act like he wants to chase you, he goes running at you, and when he gets into that rope, what happens? The rope comes tight and the dog goes down. God has Satan on a leash. God allows Satan to work in the world to test us, to strengthen us. If you want to get faster, how do you get faster? You run a lot. If you want to get stronger, how do you get stronger? You lift weights more and more. My grandfather used to tell us that if you picked up a calf when the calf was first born, and picked up the calf every day, you'd eventually be able to lift the bull. I think that was metaphorical, but his point was legitimate. That is, if you want to get stronger, you just lift increasing weight. Well, if we want to get stronger in our Christian faith, we have to be tested and stand up to that testing so that we can strengthen our Christian faith. I preached a sermon series through James about a year ago, and we went through that in some detail. Know that God is in control. And here is the biggest point, and here is the promise. Jesus promises victory. This struggle that the church in Smyrna was going through, no matter how dark it might have looked to them in that moment, they were assured of the victory. The victor will never be harmed by the second death. We have an assurance of salvation when we accept Jesus Christ. And as a result of that assurance of salvation, we have a home in heaven where we will be rich beyond measure for eternity. And I know it can seem hard even for a short period of time. If you stick your hand in a fire, 2 seconds is a long time. I understand it. But when we can put life in perspective of eternity, the greatest assurance that Jesus gives us is there is victory for overcomers. That was Jesus' message to the church in Smyrna 2,000 years ago. And it's Jesus' message to churches for the house today. Our hymn of invitation and